To set the scene for what we're about to speak, we're going to really just very quickly talk about prophetic expectations. What is it from the Word of God that we know, have confidence in relation to affairs around the world? The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, as Daniel said. Well, we read Ezekiel 38 this morning, didn't we? And Ezekiel 38 speaks about a coalition of countries, particularly Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, Gomer and Magog, which are representations of Russian and European powers. And the clear expectation of Ezekiel 38 is that there will be a dynamic alliance between Central Europe and Russia. And on the other side of the fence, there will be an opposing force led by the merchants of Tarshish and Sheba and Dedan. The merchants of Tarshish, a representation of Britain and America, Australia and countries like that. And therefore we expect to see this divide between these two alliances to continue throughout world events. And we're going to see this afternoon exactly what's happening in relation to that. What is also interesting is in Ezekiel 38, we read there Gomer and all his bands, Togarmah and all his bands. Gomer and his bands means that there is an independent army which is linked with Western Europe. And we're going to see this afternoon that's exactly where Europe is headed militarily. We're going to assume some Bible knowledge. We read this afternoon of a little horn with eyes and mouth that prevails until the Ancient of Days destroys it. So this power, this joint power between an emperor and a pope, a Holy Roman Empire, will exist until it's destroyed by Jesus Christ. And therefore we expect to see the reformation of this Holy Roman Empire, this joint power between the papacy and a military organisation. Thirdly, from the book of Revelation, we're going to see that eventually the European powers are going to cede their authority to this central power. So whilst there will be independent countries like France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, eventually they will give all their authority and power to a central reformed Holy Roman Empire. It will exist just like it did in ancient times and be destroyed by Jesus Christ. And the last prophetic expectation is in relation to the papacy itself, that the European beast, this animal that we read of in Daniel 7 and also Revelation 17, will be controlled by a very strong and powerful papacy. And this force is a force which is being unleashed across Europe today. So very briefly, that's our prophetic expectations. And we're going to see that the events of Europe are exactly that. Sweeping changes? Most certainly. This was an editorial from The Guardian last year. A tide of political change is sweeping across Europe. Old structures born from the continent's post-war political landscape have worn thin or are coming loose. A new normal arises in which once tightly held beliefs and clear left-right divides are dissolved. Voters want something new that doesn't fit old, failed patterns. And that mood is not only sweeping across Europe, it's sweeping across the world. Populism, we're going to see this afternoon, is a new force that's turning the world on its head. Quite a remarkable change. Now, this afternoon, we're going to talk about 8 key sweeping changes. And all of these sweeping changes have an impact upon Europe, and they align itself with our prophetic expectations from the scriptures of truth. Here's the first, Brexit. What a turmoil this has created in Britain and in Europe. And every time you read of negotiations falling over in this negotiation, you find, in fact, that the animosity between Britain and Europe only increases. The frustration increases. And where there was once this sense of Britain belonging to Europe, that's no longer the case at all. The Centre for European Reform made 3 points about Brexit. Firstly, it is a momentous event. So we're not talking about just something which has just happened. It is a momentous event in the history of Europe. The history of Europe, that's 1,000 years worth of history. This is a momentous event. Because what it's doing is it's extracting Britain from everything European. Britain, in the end, will oppose Europe and Russia at Armageddon. And therefore, this removal of Britain from this continent is significant. It's a momentous event, says the Centre for European Reform. Secondly, the fear of German dominance, why EU politicians are so horrified by the prospect of Brexit. So one of the key analysis of this situation is that removing Britain will elevate Germany, Central Europe, the Magog of Ezekiel 38. And lastly, the US worries that without a firm UK supporting Merkel, the EU may relax sanctions on Russia. So there will be a tilt of European influence towards Russia. Now that is precisely what the Bible has predicted. Greater German influence, removal of Britain from the affairs of Europe, and a leaning back towards Russia. It's fascinating. It's what we expect from the scriptures of truth. Klaus Well, the Secretary General of the European Parliament, says that Brexit certainly means losing capacity, but it also means that we gain the capacity to act. We're on the move again. It will be a different union from now on. So there are winds of change sweeping within the corridors of power within Europe itself. And what they find is that this fear of other countries leaving the EU will no longer apply. There's this sense of wanting to get together and make it work, which is quite remarkable considering what's happening. There is life after the EU, after Brexit, says this particular European Council of Relations. The political ball game in Europe will change profoundly after Brexit, it says. A clear realignment is already apparent as the dynamics between smaller member states in particular begins to shift. So Britain moving out of Europe has caused Europe to realign and rethink itself. Where do we go without Britain? Well, we know exactly where it will go without Britain. It will consolidate into this singular power in alliance with Russia. We can smell a change in the air. Europe is moving again. The direction of this movement is unknown and the obstacles are many. But political energy is percolating in all corners of the Union. Many countries are eager to make use of it because it doesn't fit old failed patterns. People have had enough of old failed patterns. They want something new, something dynamic. And that will be a vastly changed European Union eventually, in which the papacy and this central power will in fact dominate European affairs. Quite remarkable, isn't it, that Brexit has triggered all this renewed thinking of where we go politically in Europe. And one of the significant changes of that is that with the removal of Britain from Europe, Europe now sees itself as particularly necessary to develop an independent strike force. The EU strengthens cooperation on security and defence. In fact, that map there demonstrates the number of theatres in which, at the moment, European forces are currently involved. A lot civilian, but some military. And what is interesting is that one of those is in Palestine. They don't use the word Israel, they say Palestine. Not a recognition of Israel's occupation of that land. It's interesting that this emergence of a military aspect of Europe has found, in fact, dominance in this phrase, PESCO. PESCO stands for Permanent Structured Cooperation. It's a historic step because the deal fulfills a 70-year-old ambition among European nations to integrate their defences and marks the biggest move in at least 2 decades to match the EU's economic clout with a military clout. It's quite significant. Britain in Europe was the brakes on the engine. Britain was the stalwart supporter of NATO. With Britain removing itself from Europe, that's now asking the Europeans to rethink their military strategy. And they want an independent force. It's exactly what Ezekiel expects, Gomer and all his bands. And, of course, as we expect, PESCO is the EU army one step closer, and it has France and Germany, Gomer and Magog, as its central foundation plank. The prospect of a European army has gained momentum following a historic agreement by 25 member states. The new defence cooperation PESCO should reduce the EU's reliance on NATO. Quite remarkable, isn't it, that all of a sudden we have this feeling of nationalism and militarism because Britain's leaving. So it is a sweeping change, and that only will accelerate, a dramatic change. The second significant factor sweeping Europe is what we call the Trump factor. Donald Trump's doctrine of unpredictability has the world on edge. When it comes to foreign policy, he desires to make America appear as unpredictable as possible. It's succeeding. He's an interesting person because, you see, he is a man who wasn't expected to win the election, but God put him there, having raised up the basest of men. And this particular individual, who has very few morals and yet is firmly pro-Israel, has in fact turned the world on its head. And what he's achieved in the first few months of his office has in fact been precisely what we've been looking for in relation to some of the world affairs. You take, for example, the Iran deal. This was the deal that Obama made with Iran, that they would curtail the production of nuclear weapons in Iran, and if Iran would do that, then America would take sanctions off. Billions of dollars flooded back into Iran, and then they realised, in fact, that Iran had lied. And you may recall Netanyahu getting up with a huge PowerPoint presentation when the Israelis secretly went into Tehran and stole 500 tons of blueprint material proving that Iran itself was still not only producing nuclear material, but trying to export it as well. And he stood up on the world stage with a very simple PowerPoint presentation. 2 words: Iran lied. That was released a week before Trump made his decision. Now, what that has done is it has imposed sanctions back on Iran. But the problem is that Europe's disagreed with that. So whilst Trump breaks with European allies over this horrible one-sided nuclear agreement, what it's done is put a huge fissure, a huge gap between the US and European relations. Because what those sanctions means is that German companies and French companies and other European companies can't do business in Iran without facing huge penalties. There's an economic cost. And so what happened was that Europe not just hit back, but punched back after Trump's decision. So immediately we have this fracture between the transatlantic alliance, between America and Europe, over this one single decision. The Europeans, in fact, have now been pushed towards Russia and want to try and make the Iran deal work. It's pushed Europe away from America towards Russia, precisely as we expect. But it doesn't stop there, does it? The decision to move the US embassy to Jerusalem, and Brother Neville will mention this a bit more specifically in his address later on this afternoon. But this decision was a decision which across the world was condemned. Very few nations supported that. And of course, in addition to that, there was the awful situation with Hamas pushing against the fence in Israel itself, which was condemned by anti-Israel press such as this: Israeli carnage. There were Hamas operatives trying to breach the fence. But what that did was, again, fractured the relationship between Europe and US, because the Europeans didn't support the move of the US embassy to Jerusalem. They condemned the Israeli violence, whilst America promoted this sense of change in Israel. And it goes further. For those of you who like alliteration, taxes, tariffs, trade and Trump, this is the man who is a merchant man, the merchants of Tarshish. He's a businessman. And in the end, it's the bottom line of the balance sheet that moves Donald Trump. So he's introduced a tariff war. He's protecting American interest, and that escalates across the world. And one of the targets of his tariffs was Europe. So there was a great flurry of diplomacy between Europe and America to try and resolve this issue in relation to tariffs. And that headline says it all. Europe averts a trade war. But can it trust him? And the answer is no, it can't. And years of very carefully diplomatic relations between America and Europe have been undone in the last 6 months. It can't trust him. Can't trust him at all. And that fracture will continue. So we find that after he's been visiting Europe, he goes to meet with President Putin. I love that picture because it's got Putin's smile written all over that, because that's exactly what happened at that conference. Former Deputy Secretary of State William Burns said this is the single most embarrassing performance by an American president on the world stage that I've ever seen. Now, you wouldn't say those words lightly. In fact, when Trump got back to America, he was, in fact, roundly criticised, even by his own party. One commentator said this: if US President Donald Trump wanted to provoke most of the foreign policy establishment into a feeding frenzy, then his bizarre, baffling, and in many ways pathetic performance with Russian President Putin was a success. His behaviour is still hard to fathom. A guy who is trying to convince us that he isn't Putin's puppet and likes to portray himself as a tough, strong, and really smart man ended up exposing himself again as inarticulate, ill-prepared, gullible, and seemingly incapable of standing up to his Russian counterpart. If he were any other president, he'd be toast. And they asked the question, why? Why is it that this man who is so unfit for office is on the world stage? And we know the reason. Because the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and puts in charge of it the basest of men to further his purpose. That man is there for a reason, to shake up the old order, the establishment. And he's doing exactly that. So this is his kind of behaviour. Again, it ruptures the relationships between the West and Europe itself. NATO. NATO was introduced as a North Atlantic Treaty Organisation in which America participated with Britain and also in Europe to rebuild Europe militarily after Nazi Germany and the threat of Russian or communist expansion. So he goes across there, and what he does is he sits down and he berates his NATO allies, and then he asks them to double their payments. Now, do you think that's going to work? I mean, what kind of reaction are you going to get in that negotiating table from those kind of tactics? Well, you can imagine that it was a pretty hostile, bristly kind of conference. You slap them around the head and then you ask for double the fees. In fact, Trump made this particular point, that Germany is captive to Russia. Of course, that got a reaction from Angela Merkel. And he was talking about the way in which there was this huge dependency of Germany upon Russian gas and energy. He spoke it as it was. We got a reaction. Now, what this is doing is it's driving Europe away from Russia, away from America, into the arms of Russia. That brings us to the third sweeping change. We've always known there was a dependency of Europe upon Russian energy. Well, it's becoming more and more dependent. And that photograph there is a Russian oil and gas facility 2,500 kilometres northeast of Moscow on the edge of the permafrost in Siberia. And that's just a fraction of that kind of factory there. It is a huge enterprise. And repeatedly, the press is making the point that Europe is dependent on Russian gas than ever before. Gazprom is announcing record deliverance of its energy. And this is the kind of dependence we're talking about. 30% of the European Union's gas comes from Russia, of which 40% goes into Germany. And those arrows represent pipelines which are continuing into this. It's like claws, hooks going into Europe itself. There is this dependency upon all of this energy. Now that's intriguing, you see, because we know that Magog, of Ezekiel 38, that the Germany, the Central Europe, will in fact be in alliance with Russia. And this will be one of the mechanisms to achieve that. Now, there's an interesting article in Politico which made this point here, that Germany is playing a double game with Russia. Berlin balances business interests and political concerns with the Kremlin. It's a very careful balancing game. This is how they expressed it. When it comes to Russia, Germany knows how to juggle. It can deliver Moscow a foreign policy slap whilst also protecting its energy interests. A case in point is Berlin's actions this week. It expelled 4 Russian diplomats to show solidarity with the United Kingdom over the alleged poisoning of a former spy by Russia. But just a day later, German authorities gave Russia's energy giant Gazprom the green light to build the contentious €9.5 billion Nord Stream 2 pipeline through its waters. So it's very deft, playing the game on one side and yet kowtowing to Russia on the other. In fact, one German socialist member of parliament said this: the Russian economy is highly dependent on the income from gas imports to the EU, which creates a strong mutual dependence between us. And it is a strong mutual dependence. They need each other. Russia needs the revenue. Europe needs the energy. And together, linking together, there's this dependency. And Trump's position is pushing Europe towards Russia. Now, this Nord Stream here on the map is really quite interesting. See, the problem at the moment is that a lot of the gas comes through countries like the Ukraine. So the Ukraine is a pivotal part of the transport corridor of energy. And if Ukraine's in a mess, that puts the energy in jeopardy. So what Putin has said is, we're going to actually bring the gas direct into Germany with no intermediaries. And that's the point of the Nord Stream 2 line. Goes under the ocean, straight into Germany. That's now been signed. Controversial, because it has this absolute dependence on Russia. That pipeline will double the capacity of Russia to introduce gas into Europe. It's a phenomenal geopolitical tool as far as Russia is concerned. They've signed that, and that mutual dependency will increase until finally Magog and Rosh are together. The fourth great sweeping change in Europe is, in fact, this whole issue of illegal immigration. And this event has, in fact, created enormous pressure within European politics, as well as the relationship between European countries. And it's had a knock-on effect in a number of different ways in the last 2 to 3 years. These migrants are fleeing from awful conditions in North Africa. And they're fleeing into a better world, a greener pasture up there in the north. And it is in epidemic proportions. This map here demonstrates the percentage of Muslim population in Europe today. On the right-hand side there, you'll see that as a percentage of population, Germany has 5.8% Muslim, France has 7.5%, UK has 4.8%. That is a considerable amount of political clout in the electorate in those regions. An enormously strong population of Muslims, and they've all come, sorry, not all of them, many have come through this corridor of illegal immigration. Now, that has a knock-on effect, and one of those knock-on effects is the increase of terrorism. And all those countries that have received these people have tragically experienced terror attacks. And France and Germany and Britain have experienced of that. So it's put this huge pressure on European thought. What are we going to do with all of these Muslims who we've introduced into our country as guests, and they turn around, and some of them are radicalised, and they attempt to destroy the hand that feeds them? Well, that creates a number of knock-on effects. And one of the huge changes is the pressure put on the Jewish people living in Europe. The Atlantic had an article, "Is it time for the Jews to leave Europe?" For the increase in Islamic influence in Europe has translated into anti-Semitic behaviour by those Islamic populations. They have been unable to leave their anti-Semitism back where they came from, and they are still maintaining those anti-Jewish feelings. Violence against Jews in Western Europe today, according to those who track it, is coming mainly from Muslims, particularly in France, which is the epicentre of Europe's Jewish crisis. They outnumber Jews 10 to 1. What is interesting is that this new anti-Semitism flourishing in the corners of the European Muslim community would be impoverished without the incorporation of European fascists' tropes or diatribes. So what this article is saying is that this Islamic anti-Semitism is being fuelled by fascist politicians who are using that particular behaviour to promote their own interests. So one Jew said, "I am worried about sending my children to a Jewish school because they're targets, but in public schools, Jewish kids are themselves individual targets. So it doesn't matter what education I send them to, in the end they are targets of anti-Semitism." And that's only increasing. In Rome last summer, Anne Frank is a liar was sprayed on the walls of the former Jewish ghetto. And even in England itself, more than half the British Jews surveyed said they fear Jews have no future in Great Britain, even in places like the UK, which you think would be more tolerant of this. You see, European Jews don't have a bright future. A declining population, the return of the old habits of anti-Semitism, the rise of far-right politicians are all contributing to this sense of we hate the Jews. The Holocaust, as a concept, held Europe at bay with a conscience. And that's now changing as people no longer have the memory of the Holocaust in World War II. And all that means is that this continual radicalisation of Islamic people is having an effect. So the Jerusalem Post ran this article, "The Toxic Reality of Anti-Semitism in Europe. It's not only dangerous for Jews to oppose Europeans having their own national and cultural identity, it's morally wrong. Anti-Semitism in Europe has become mainstream and normalised at a level not seen since the Second World War." So says the president of the European Jewish Congress. "There has been an increase in open, unashamed and explicit hatred directed against Jews." And all of that will have a continual national focus when Russia and Europe will try and eliminate the Jewish state itself. And this anti-Semitism that's brewing and becoming more dangerous by the hour, parallel to World War II when Hitler was in control, that will have a national focus, and in the end Israel as a nation will be targeted by these people. Tragic. It's as if a veil lowered after the Holocaust has been lifted to reveal that very little has changed. What a tragic situation. A tragic situation. And that brings us to our sixth sweeping change. You see, because the increase of illegal immigrants, the increase of this phobia against the Jewish people by the Islamic immigrants, has led to a rise of what's called populism. What is populism? Populism is mainly right-leaning, and one commentator said it's the most sweeping change in the 21st century in Europe. Let me read these words from the Brookings Institute. The Brookings Institute is a group of international leaders from government and academia. The rise of populism, mostly right-leaning, is the most important European political development of the 21st century. Now, those words aren't written lightly. It has eaten into support for traditional centre-right parties while dealing a knockout blow to the centre-left. So traditional parties, left and right, have been devastated by the rise of populism. The result is the end of the centre-left, centre-right duopoly that has dominated European politics since the end of World War II. So we're talking about a political change in the way Europe's been run for the last 70 years. Party systems throughout Europe have fragmented and most have shifted toward the right, and the rise of populism has opened the door to increased Russian influence throughout Europe. That's a staggering thing to think about. A dismantling of the old regime. This is like French Revolution stuff. This is like 1848, which is the revolutions that swept Europe. This is a significant change where populism is on the rise and it's going right, to the far right. And it's opening the door to Russian influence. Isn't that what we expect? Of course it is. So we find when we draw a graph of the rise of populism across Europe that countries like Hungary and Greece and Poland, Italy and the Czech Republic are all front runners for these kinds of governments. They affect society, and they affect society in a way which is quite radical. You take, for example, Viktor Orban, who has just recently been re-elected for the third time in Hungary. So this is on the edge of the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Viktor Orban is a very right-wing kind of person. He is definitely pro-Russian, and particularly he is pro-Christian. He's prone to give long lectures on Hungary's historical role in defeating Islam and defending European Christianity from Muslim invasion. Hungary was at the forefront of that, actually. When the Islamic power swept through the 1600s into Europe, Hungary was the one that managed to stop that advance. This man is keen to go back to the Catholic roots and say how we defeated Islam. He's put fences around the country preventing more Islamic immigrants coming in. This is what the article said from the Financial Times. Because Putin's embrace of ethno-nationalism and religious traditionalism has proved attractive to populist movements, their rise has strengthened Russian influence throughout Europe. He, that's Putin, offers an attractive model of unapologetic patriotism and national confidence, opening the doors to authoritarianism and the erosion of individual liberties. And that's the populist kind of government of Hungary and Poland and Czech Republic and even a little bit of Italy. Nationalistic, traditional Christian roots, erosion of individual liberties, authoritarian rule. This is almost turning the pages back to World War II, isn't it? It's almost turning the pages back to that kind of atmosphere. Catholicism thrives in that kind of atmosphere. Traditional Catholic roots, patriotism, this is on the rise. So we find, for example, that in Austria, just next door, the coalition government with a far-right party takes power in Austria. Here's the youngest leader in the world, 31, Sebastian Kurz, swept to power, very popular, very charismatic, far right in Austria. This is the birthplace of Adolf Hitler. So, one particular diplomat wasn't very diplomatic. He said this: Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, anti-immigrant parties are on the rise, and this movement's in power in Austria. He hates Muslims, he hates Jews, he hates immigrants. It's on the rise. So we find that when he came to power, that there were demonstrations outside the parliament and they were waving flags which said Nazis out of parliament. Even their own people recognise this individual is so far right. The parallels are ominous. So just the other month, he shut down 7 mosques and exiled a number of imams. See, Austria is home to 700,000 Muslims. Now, all of this plays to the people. All of this plays to a political audience. It's highly right-wing, and this populism is sweeping Europe. So, for example, even in Italy, which is the first Western European country to experience a populist government, we have a change there. We have this, I'm sick and tired of the old, we're going to bring in something new, something to shake up the known order. And Giuseppe Conte is sworn in as an anti-establishment government, where these right-wing parties have now made a coalition moving and demanding change in Europe. It's quite significant. And commentators are saying that we need to watch this space. Things are on the move, and we expect the eventual result to be this reformed Holy Roman Empire, a strong central government with a dominant Catholic Church. But the Europeans are fighting back. So we find there's another change happening within European politics. European politics is turning French. This is interesting because you see, this man, Emmanuel Macron, is also a very young leader in France. And people were interested to know how this man came to power because he was fighting right-wing populism. Marine Le Pen, you may know of her, she's a right-wing French politician. And people expected Marine Le Pen to sweep into power and to have this other right-wing populism happening everywhere else. So how was it that Emmanuel Macron got into power? And therefore they study the way in which this man led his government to power. In fact, he's also a bit of a populist, but he's a centre populist. And his platform was very interesting. He also condemned the old way of doing political business, but his solution was less radical than the right. In fact, his solution is quite interesting. At the beginning of the year, there was a huge tiff between Germany and America. Donald Trump personally snubbed Angela Merkel, and Macron stepped in to try and pick up the pieces. And what he did was he, over the last 12 months, has given a new vision for Europe. And as the article says there, the French president has a vision to lead the deadlocked EU out of crisis and towards greater integration. But can he carry the rest of the bloc with him, especially the troubled Germans? So this is interesting. Can you see the pattern happening here? Illegal immigrants. That puts pressure, we're talking millions of people, that puts pressure on politicians. That changes the picture of Europe to populist government. That in turn has a pressure on Jews. That has a pressure on other people. And that in effect has another knock-on reaction of people who want the European Union to succeed to also fight back against populism, and that's what Macron's doing. So his vision is very clear. He wants an integrated Europe. That's an interesting language, isn't it? So what he does is he says, well, look, the current European position is really untenable for 3 reasons. Firstly, individual European countries are too weak on their own. And when you see that word weak, for those of you who like Bible echoes, that's almost Daniel chapter 2, isn't it, where you have the feet of iron and clay, partly strong and partly weak. He said individuals are weak, this country and that country. Secondly, we have no common political clout. We all seem to have a diversity of political views. We somehow have to change that structure. And we don't seem to have a single economic vision with a shared government. So how are we going to change Europe, he says? Well, the first thing he says, I want larger European sovereignty. I want to bring all of these nations together in a single European entity and have a single European doctrine, a single European budget, a single European army, a single European everything. That's exactly what we expect to happen. I want, he says, the creation of single de facto state. I want to reform Europe, to have a European-wide referendum. And if you're not in the game, you'll be left out. Now, that vision has come under pressure in the last few months as Europeans are struggling with all of their issues. But that's Macron's vision, and he wants to make it through. In fact, he recently received the Charlemagne Prize, which is the prize which you give politicians and leaders for unifying Europe. And as he received that prize, he said to Angela Merkel, "I am still out to change Europe." It's French, it's the French Revolution influence, but it is a tighter, integrated, large community, a United States of Europe. That's precisely what is happening. That will probably prevail, and populism, however that happens, and he's a populist governor, may in fact take a more centre stride. We will wait and see. But the other huge thing with Macron is this. He's made overtures to the Catholic Church. Now, the French, in the French Revolution, dismantled the Catholic Church and separated church and state. It was a revolution in so many ways. And when this man in France, in Paris, got up and said, we need stronger ties with the Catholic Church, that sent off all alarm bells throughout France. But you see, this man has a religious background, a Catholic religious background, and he's interested in bringing Catholicism into the heart of Europe. It's exactly what we expect. Fascinating. And that brings us to the eighth part of the sweeping changes within Europe itself, and it deals with the papacy, the papal influence in EU politics. It's on the march. There was an interesting survey done, actually. The Washington Post published this under the heading, "Catholics like the European Union more than Protestants do." This is why. It's the most unusual title to have for a newspaper article. In their new book, Religion and the Struggle for European Union, the political scientists Brent Nelson and James Guth explore an unlikely source of support for and opposition to European Union. It's called religion. And public opinion surveys from as far back as the 1970s show that Catholics tend to favour European integration and Protestants tend to, in fact, resist it. And they give an interview on their book, really quite interesting. So one of the comments was this, that the Catholics see Europe as a single cultural whole that ought to be governed in some coordinated way. They're happy with the whole of Europe concept. Protestants, on the other hand, have seen the nation state as a bulwark against Catholic hegemony, and they have been very reluctant to give it up. Isn't that interesting? Just this religious perception of power. Catholics are very happy with a supranational, a huge hegemony, whilst Protestants like individual countries. Catholicism has always been a universal religion. It was the successor to the Roman Empire, and in Catholic theology and ideology, there's always been an emphasis on the unity of Christendom. Even today, even though the Pope doesn't claim secular authority, there's still supernatural governance within the Roman Catholic Church. So Catholics have always been comfortable, even if subconsciously, with the notion of a supranational governance, a whole integration with one head. They're comfortable with that. So they asked the question to their respondents, is Catholic support for the EU a result of explicit church guidance, or is it simply an implicit cultural value? Has the Catholic Church actually been pumping out a message politically? It's both, says the answer. The Catholic Church has explicitly supported European integration since World War II. It has a political agenda. Every pope since the end of World War II has been very supportive of the EU. In 2014, Pope Francis gave a talk at the European Parliament about the need for the EU to rediscover its vision. Catholics are getting cues from the top, even if they're very subtle. So the Catholic Church has a political agenda. And very subtly, it says we want an integration of Europe, with Catholicism, of course, at its head. So we find that Pope Francis has received the Charlemagne Award. This is normally for political leaders. He gets the prize for his attempt to bring together European unity. The 60th anniversary of the European Union was held in the Vatican, and I think ironically it was held in the backdrop of Michelangelo's The Last Judgment. How ironic is that? You can't miss him, can you? All in white, all in the centre, he is a unique. You don't see the Archbishop of Canterbury there. You don't see any Muslim authorities there. You don't see the head of the Reformed Church there, but you do see the Pope. He's always in the centre. He made a speech. He, in fact, castigated the European leaders, and this article says that when he spoke to them the second time round, it was less of a rebuke. He's influencing. EU risks dying, needs new vigour and passion, says Pope Francis. He's in there making his voice heard. In a recent conference of bishops and politicians, the Pope said this: "In our day, Christians are calling to revitalise Europe and to revive its conscience, not by occupying spaces, but by generating processes capable of awakening new energies in society." And by Christians, he means Catholics. We are called to revitalise Europe, he said. That's our position. This is to the lay population out there, the millions of Catholic adherents. You're needed to revitalise Europe. It's a cue from the top. But behind that smile, behind that benign demeanour, is something altogether different. And there have been a number of books that have been released recently on the real Pope, the real character behind this individual who holds enormous power. Here is the advertising blurb for this book. Could Pope Francis be the most tyrannical and unprincipled pontiff in modern times? Yes, says church historian Marcantonio Colonna, which is a pseudonym, in his controversial yet judicious new book, The Dictator Pope. By the way, this is a bestseller at the moment. Close observers in his native land already recognised Francis to be a manipulative politician, skilled at self-promotion, a disciple of the populist dictator Juan Perón. And behind the benign smile of the people's pope, Colonna reveals a ruthless autocrat, aggressively asserting the powers of the papacy in pursuit of a radical agenda. Those are bold, challenging words. Behind the mask of a genial man of the people is a pope who cares shockingly little about the theology or liturgy, but is obsessed with his own power and given to profanity-laced outbursts of anger. It's the eyes and mouth, the little horn of Daniel 7. Allying himself with the most corrupt elements in the Vatican, Francis rules by fear. He has obstructed or reversed the very reforms that were expected of him and attempted to alter Catholic teaching by subterfuge. The Dictator Pope is essential reading to understand one of the most enigmatic and dangerous figures to occupy the see of St. Peter. Those are controversial words. And there have been several other books recently released which tend to suggest that kind of picture of the papacy itself. Behind the benign smile is a person who cares very little about religion, but all about self-promotion and politics. That's the face of Revelation 17. Because this is the final picture of Europe. Revelation 17 describes an impure woman, drunk with immorality and violence, sitting astride a European beast, guiding and controlling it, not only to invade Israel with Russia, but also to resist the Lord Jesus Christ when he returns. Come out of her, my people, was the warning of Revelation 18. Have nothing to do with that system. Nothing at all to do with that system. This is the enemy of the last days. It is a frightening picture. And it's a picture that is, in fact, being seen developing in Europe today a very strong Catholic presence in a very troubled European theatre. So as we bring our comments to a conclusion, we can take hope that the Lord Jesus Christ will soon be in the earth, that these trends that we're seeing are in fact confirming the prophetic jigsaw puzzle that we know to be true. And this whole system will in fact last until it's destroyed by Jesus Christ. Even so, come, Lord Jesus.